This is London, one of the world's most iconic cities, with 9 million residents. But beneath its majestic landmarks and bustling streets lies 2,000 years of history that wasn't always so nice. Dig beneath any London street, and you'll find a foot-thick layer of ash and human remains. The calling card of Britain's most famous rebel queen. It's 43 AD, and this man, the Roman Emperor Claudius, comes up with a wild idea: conquer Britain. And when I say wild, I mean really wild. The Romans thought of Britain as an exotic, scary place. Virgil said it was an island totally cut off from the whole world. In other words, it was the perfect way for an accidental emperor to build up his street cred in Rome. The invasion succeeded, and in only a few years, the legions established a strategic settlement to the north bank of the Thames. They called it Londinium. Look at a map and you'll see why they chose this spot. It was the first place upstream where the river could be easily bridged, creating a crucial crossing point. But that first wooden bridge, built around 50 AD, changed the character of the settlement. It wasn't just a military outpost now, but a vital transportation hub. Soon, goods from across the empire, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, exotic spices from the east flowed here. The fort had become a city. It almost didn't stay that way. The Romans were about to learn that wild places cut off from the world don't get conquered so easily. The lesson came from a source they would never expect. It's 60 AD, and the Britons rise in revolt against Roman rule. And their leader was this woman, one of the most famous in history, Queen Boudicca. In revenge for the way Rome had treated her and her daughters, she swept down on London and burned everything in it. You don't need to read slanted Roman reports about this incident. Just go beneath London's streets. Dig deep enough and you'll find a layer of red-brown debris a foot thick. Archaeologists call it the Boudicca destruction layer. And it's a testament to the city's first major catastrophe. Almost 400 years later, there would be a much worse one. Rome might have beaten Boudicca and rebuilt London, but the so-called barbarians had the last laugh. The Roman Empire got into deep trouble as the centuries passed, and Britain was abandoned in 410. Life on the island changed dramatically. Large-scale trade ended. There weren't even coins. With a subsistence and barter economy, there was no need for a trading hub like London. The city was almost deserted. But just like their Roman predecessors, waves of new conquerors recognized the importance of this location on the Thames. Look at the early Anglo-Saxons, and you might think history was repeating itself. They built a fort a mile west of the Roman city called Ludenberg, London Fort. This was the beginning of the modern neighborhood of Covent Garden. Then the Vikings came, and they took an even greater interest in the area, fixing the Roman walls. The city changed hands several times until the greatest conqueror of them all arrived. London was one of the spoils that this man, William of Normandy, won at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Now King of England, he made his mark immediately. In the southeast corner of the old Roman city, he built a massive stone fortress, the White Tower, standing 90 feet tall with walls between 10 and 15 feet thick. It wasn't just a fortification, but an advertisement. The message to the locals was clear: submit to Norman rule or else. William's successors expanded this fortress into what we now know as the Tower of London. Today's tourists snap selfies where prisoners once carved their final words into stone. But by the late medieval period and long afterward, the phrase "sent to the tower" struck fear into the hearts of Londoners. Why? Well, fortunately, we can now peek inside safely from the comfort of our chairs. Within these cold stone walls, prisoners face grim conditions. This was a place designed to break its unfortunate inhabitants. Literally, this is the infamous rack. There were a lot of them in the tower, and you can probably tell what it was designed to do. For those deemed enemies of the state, the tower was just a waypoint before their final journey. Condemned prisoners would cross the Thames through this entrance, the infamous Traitor's Gate, knowing they would likely never leave alive. The luckiest might face a quick end on Tower Hill, where crowds gathered to witness the spectacle. Some kings were better at staging these shows than others. You probably know one of the best. Under Henry VIII, the fortress became a stage for some of history's most notorious political slayings. In 1535, Sir Thomas More, once Henry's trusted advisor, was condemned for refusing to accept the king as head of the Church of England. A year later, Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, met the same fate on trumped-up charges of adultery and incest. King Henry even imported a skilled French swordsman for the deed, a small mercy ensuring a clean, swift death rather than the potentially botched job of an English axeman. That wasn't the case for his fifth wife. For her alleged affair, Catherine Howard was eventually sent through the Traitor's Gate, screaming and struggling. A month after she arrived, she went to the scaffold. The Tower of London served as a prison into the 20th century. 11 German prisoners of war, accused of being spies, met their fate here during World War I, and the notorious Rudolf Hess was held here during World War II. The last prisoners were Ronald and Reginald Cray. The gangsters were jailed here for 4 days in 1952. The Tower of London saw many tragedies over nearly a millennia, but they paled in comparison to the events of only 1 year. The Black Death hit Europe hard in 1347. As much as 60% of the population may have succumbed. London didn't escape these events. The pandemic arrived in 1348 and didn't leave until 1350, taking as many as 100,000 people, twice as many as in Paris. Why? Because, even by pre-modern standards, London was less than sanitary. The Thames River was a magnet for pollution, and badly managed cesspits were a much more common sight than the Tower. King Edward III harangued the council about the sanitation issues. It innocently replied that all of the city's street cleaners had died from the plague. Yet somehow, London recovered. New migrants moved in from the countryside. Trade resumed, and life went on. Until the next outbreak. The plague wasn't just a one-time visitor. It returned to London repeatedly over the next 3 centuries, with major outbreaks occurring every 20 to 30 years. The worst of these recurrences came in 1665, the Great Plague of London. By this time, the city had grown substantially, with a population approaching 500,000. So the plague had lots of hosts indeed. It spread rapidly through the eastern and northern parishes. The wealthy fled to the countryside. King Charles II, his court, and the English Parliament abandoned the city for Oxford. Those who couldn't escape faced a nightmare. Authorities imposed desperate measures. Infected households were shut up, literally sealed inside their homes with the sick and healthy together. A red cross painted on the door with the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." Guards were posted outside to prevent escape. About 70,000 people were officially recorded as having lost their lives, but the true number was likely closer to 100,000. The plague ended in 1666, but it was merely the first in a devastating 1-2 punch to the city. Boudicca's fire isn't the only scorched layer in London's archaeological history. There is another. A fire broke out in the early hours of September 2, 1666, in a baker's shop on Pudding Lane. Strong winds drove it through the tightly packed wooden structures of a London that was still mostly medieval in its architecture and layout. The narrow streets acted as channels for the inferno, which leapt from house to house with terrifying speed. It burned for 3 days. Over 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, St. Paul's Cathedral, and most of the city's governmental buildings were charred to cinders. An area of approximately 436 acres, virtually the entire city within the old Roman walls, had been destroyed. Miraculously, only 10 deaths were officially recorded, though the true toll among the poor likely went uncounted, and 100,000 people were left homeless. The fire wasn't in vain, though. It gave the city the opportunity to rebuild under a much more sanitary plan, with wider streets and sturdier homes. Under architects like this man, Christopher Wren, the skyline would be transformed. By 1676, most of the damage had been rebuilt, and in 1710, the building that would serve as a symbol of Britain's greatness was completed, St. Paul's Cathedral, with its iconic dome. It would remain London's tallest building until 1963, and it signaled the beginning of a new age. With victory over France and political and economic innovations that made it the world's financial center, Britain was set to take the stage as an empire the likes of which even the Romans could never imagine. London might have entered its imperial age, but that didn't mean the end of the city's tragedies. The next tragedy wouldn't come from the plague or fire, but from progress itself. The skyline was now dominated by factory chimneys belching black smoke that shrouded it in a constant haze. Those were London's factories at work, and they were the backbone of Britain's power. They were also places of mass-produced horror. Workers, some of them as young as 5, often had to spend 14 or more hours on these floors, taking extreme risks for wages that earned in a week what a gentleman spent on lunch. In match factories, women and even little girls developed phossy jaw, a horrific condition caused by phosphorus exposure that rotted their jawbones from the inside out. In the textile mills, children crawled beneath moving machinery to clear debris, risking dismemberment or worse if they weren't quick enough. And where did these workers live when they actually went home? Usually in slums like Jacob's Island. The houses were built over a tidal ditch filled with raw sewage. When this man, a journalist named Henry Mayhew, saw it in 1849, he described the water as the color of strong green tea and so thick with animal and vegetable matter that it ferments in the summer months. Unsurprisingly, cholera was a common companion. This extreme inequality created a real tale of two cities: the West End of wealth and privilege, the East End of poverty and desperation. Nowhere was this division clearer than in Whitechapel, which was about to see the rise of one of history's most notorious criminals. Jack the Ripper terrorized London in the summer and fall of 1888. His crime spree ended with 5 confirmed fatalities, but his impact was even more profound. His crimes exposed the brutal reality of life in the East End to the wider world. Newspapers published stark details of the crimes alongside descriptions of the dark conditions in which the victims lived. Middle-class Londoners could no longer ignore the city's inequality, and this led to enormous changes. The white phosphorus matches that led to phossy jaw were banned. Jacob's Island was cleaned up and filled in, and the slum demolished. But Londoners wouldn't be able to enjoy the improvements made in working and living conditions for long. As the early 20th century came, they would see mechanized destruction on an unprecedented scale. It was a time when the world was at war and London didn't escape. In World War I, the Germans flew these Zeppelins over the skies, turning their engines off and striking silently. Gotha bombers like these followed in 1917. The air raids were terrifying, especially the one on June 13th of that year, when Gotha and giant bombers struck the city and nearby Kent. The air raid took 162 people, including 18 children at a school in the East End neighborhood that was only just starting to come out of its earlier 19th century horrors. 300,000 people took shelter in London's subway system during these raids, but even worse was yet to come. The most devastating attack came during World War II. On September 7, 1940, nearly 350 German aircraft dropped their deadly payloads on the docks and East End. This was the beginning of the Blitz, a sustained bombing campaign that would continue until May 1941. Londoners again took shelter, in the Tube, but also in basement shelters, the crypts of churches, and anywhere else they could as explosions shook the city above them. The sound became grimly familiar: the air raid sirens' wail, the drone of bomber engines, the whistle of falling bombs, and then explosions that destroyed city blocks. Over 43,000 civilians perished across Britain during the Blitz, with more than half in London. Over 1 million homes were destroyed or damaged. Historic landmarks like the Houses of Parliament, Westminster Abbey, and Buckingham Palace were hit. But London stayed strong. Its people look to their tallest building, with its dome defiantly standing amid the bombs going off around it. St. Paul's survived, and so did London. The British Empire might have ended in the years after the war, but London remains one of the world's capitals, marked with gleaming skyscrapers, vibrant theaters, and fashionable trends. But all of these marvels stand on ground that has witnessed 2 millennia of hard lessons learned, a sign that the best and worst of human nature often exist uncomfortably close, side by side. Bye for now.